Okay, hi everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 9th. Welcome to the SIG Testing weekly meeting. I'm Aaron Kirkenberger, and this meeting is being publicly recorded and will be posted to later. First up, I'm going to hand off to Steve to talk about tests for secure repositories in Prow. I think we've been bumping into a number of issues lately with regards to security-related fixes. Steve?
Yep. So I think in Kubernetes itself, the Kubernetes security repo and downstream organizations that use Prow similarly have repos where developers do work on embargoed CVEs. And in the next 2 quarters or so, I think we should at least figure out our plan for supporting those types of repos. I think for us, we'd like to see a flow where a developer can work against a repo, develop code for embargoed CVEs, and have as nearly similar a workflow as they would have on a normal repo. So that means looking at currently running tests in deck. It means looking at their results in Kubernetes, hopefully getting the same interaction with bots in the repo, and all that. And I think the 2 major worries in this process are going to be making sure that we don't leak any information about the CVEs or what's being worked on, and also making sure that we segregate the jobs and infrastructure as much as is necessary so they're in a different security domain. And I guess the open questions that I have that we could touch on here, and also I'm thinking we should do a breakout meeting for this later. Is it reasonable to have one set of infrastructure to handle both normal testing and testing for secure repos? Do we need 2 entirely different Kubernetes clusters hosting 2 entirely different sets of infrastructure in 2 different security domains? Do we, basically, do we want to continue the current behavior where we just ignore them and have people look at the data using some other side channel? How should it look? What's the best thing we want? And what are we willing to do with the tools that we have today? So I don't know if anyone has any opinions on that. I know Cole and Ben have been doing a bunch of work on that recently.
It would be relatively straightforward to make Kubernetes, to protect pages on Kubernetes. So if you only gave Kubernetes the access to your bucket, and you could validate the GitHub users are inside of the right, inside of some arbitrary group. The one problem is some of the other stuff, like browsing all the artifacts, might have to change to maybe be done through the GCS browser. And some of the other features like expand all logs might not work.
Right, and so I guess I think there's 2 pieces of trust there. So I think we'd have to trust GitHub, and I think we already do that anyway. Obviously, the repos that control that stuff are on GitHub. So I think using GitHub OAuth to drive the authentication into those views seems reasonable. Would you expect one Kubernetes instance to handle all of these things? Would you expect a different Kubernetes instance inside of a different security domain? Does it matter?
I think one Kubernetes instance could do it. I don't see any reason why that's not possible. You'll need the security controls to be on the bucket anyways. Although you could probably deploy it a little bit faster right now, because you could make a Kubernetes instance where all pages require login and authentication. You could do that, but
I guess any bugs in that setup potentially leak information. So I don't know what. I think technically we could implement something that would, bar people from viewing those pages without the requisite information, but I'm not sure if that is kosher from a security standpoint.
There's a pretty limited number of endpoints that actually all go through a certain through the same code path, so I think it would be pretty easy to lock it down correctly.
Right. I guess the question is, do we as a SIG feel comfortable taking that responsibility on? Or would we rather approach it by putting a separate deployment of Kubernetes somewhere else that has not, like, doesn't have that issue?
I mean, I kind of wonder if, so I'm not super familiar with the way that Prow currently interacts with the Kubernetes security GitHub organization versus the rest of the repos and organizations that it interacts with, but it seems like a pretty clear conceptual break to me if you were to have a completely separate Prow instance for embargoed repos or private repos. And I'm curious, like, it seems like we live in some middle ground today. I'm curious what drove us to do that and like what additional incentive we would have to make the middle ground of like one Prow for everything. Because it seems like you're right, that accepts a lot more liability, so to speak. Just like, you know, in terms of not leaking information, I don't have to worry about a different set of Prow jobs or a different set of repos or a different set of plugins or a different set of users. Like it's all in a completely separate deployment. And it's not quite push button, but it's pretty close to being able to just stand up a Prow anywhere you so choose.
So I can't speak to the specific choices made for Kubernetes security, but I do know that like running a separate Prow instance, if you're not using a hosted Kubernetes provider, it does mean also you are managing another Kubernetes cluster. Like that's a non-trivial amount of work. Managing Prow is pretty minimal these days, but I mean, at the same time, that's also non-trivial. Getting the webhooks delivered, if the security domain for the thing is behind a firewall or whatever, I mean, it can be done, but there's also more work there. Keeping the config in sync. There's just a lot of these like little things I think that build up and make that less of a, oh, let's just have a second one. But I mean, that could be our solution to this problem.
Yeah, the separate domains does actually sound easier if you're going to have a separate deployment for everything. And then just every page under that deployment would require login with the appropriate group or user.
And I guess the tangential question is, do we ever want to support private repositories that don't necessarily contain embargoed information, where a separate security domain may be overkill and maybe it's just the proprietary knowledge thing that somebody doesn't want to have out?
I think that could probably use some fleshing out in the name of completeness or feature parity, making sure that Prowl behaves appropriate. Like most of our stack behaves appropriately for private repos versus public repos, but I feel like that would better be considered via a proposal where it's like, here are the sort of weird dents that we have right now with private repos. And I think, like, I don't know if it's impossible to run two instances of Prowl on the same Kubernetes cluster. That, again, conceptually seems like something we could stand to maybe support. I know Prowl kind of operates as though it's got sole purview of its build clusters since it generally floods them to capacity with jobs. But being able to run instances of Prowl on the same Kubernetes cluster kind of makes sense to me. You should be able to scope them out by namespace or something like that. And if that's an issue, and that again seems like for completeness sake, we might want to clean that up.
Yeah, I think the one barrier to that right now is that we just store all the Prowl jobs in the API server. So we need some way to partition those.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, the short answer would be if, embargoed security workflows are super important for the foreseeable future, it's probably just simplest to document how to do that with a separate instance of Prowl. The overhead it takes to manage a separate cluster if you need to. But sort of at least documenting like how you can do that and how that differs from the slightly in the middle thing we have today could be a good starting point, I think.
I guess Cole, Ben, is the Kubernetes security repo being handled by the main Prowl cluster for this foreseeable future? Do you expect to stand up a second one? What's your long-term plan there?
We've been planning to handle it with the same cluster and to just have a flag that tells everything that this is an embargoed organization. basically.
And you'd expect people to be looking at the output from that using side channel.
It'll still post. It'll still post the statuses to GitHub, and beyond that, that's kind of like TBD. It's in a private bucket, so they could view the bucket if they really need the logs or something. I think right now they mostly just really want to be able to make sure it passes. They're running tests locally as well, but they want to make sure that when the patch is done, if they go to upstream it to the original repo, that it will pass the test there. So we just want the tests to be the same and run the same way. So you mostly just need the signal. Like, to pass log viewing would be great, but that's like kind of a separate issue.
I mean, not sure how it would run.
Well, like for example, Kubernetes is like a whole separate set of tooling.
How are they? How are developers? Like, if a developer gets to a failed test on one of those PRs, do they just browse to the private bucket themselves?
We're not there yet, but no, like even if you had a separate Prow instance or something, you'd have the same problem of like securing a way to view those logs.
Right.
So putting those in a different directory is like orthogonal to Prow. It's just a flag to the job.
Right. So I guess my question was not only just Prow, but also like full through the stack. You know, you'd want a developer to be as productive on this as possible.
I think we'd want some way to authenticate with Kubernetes, right? To show logs that way.
Probably be ideal, but we weren't looking at that yet because we need to finish being able to have this like secure running tests and like its own cluster with credentials and like all that.
So I think another part that we need to think about is I suspect there is assumptions in our tooling that the places we write things to in GCS is publicly readable. So I feel like, you know, long term, I think it would be great if we could have a single Prow instance and Kubernetes instance that does both public and secure and private repositories. But I think that there's going to be, you know, issues that we need to tease out. And I think maybe in a short term, having a separate deployment might be easier. But I think there's going to be technical issues that would not allow us to do that just yet. Like, I don't think that, you know, GCS web is going to work with non-public objects. And I don't think that various parts of our tooling will work if it can't just list things. But those are things we could fix. And I think we should fix them over time.
And do you feel comfortable moving to a place where there is an authentication layer in a place like Kubernetes or in front of something like DEC that guards information about embargoed CVE information?
I would very much prefer something like Kubernetes. We don't really foresee DEC as being the way to view like completed jobs. It's so much. It's kind of like seeing what's going on. We upload things to GCS, and DEC doesn't really interact with GCS.
Right, but I mean, at the same time, like, you'd want a Prow administrator to be able to understand the system as well. Like, just hiding the information and not having a way to look at it unless you're on the cluster and doing a Prow job list.
Well, but if you are an administrator, you can get on the cluster and look at those things, and it's the same information.
Yeah, but presented nicely. And
I think long-term DEC,
you're capable of looking at Prow job entries.
I think long-term, it's pretty obvious to me that DEC should work for secure repos.
So I guess sort of in the interest of time, I think there are a couple warts that have come out in this discussion, and the thing I'm not aware that we have is documentation of the plan that we're executing on right now, as well as potential desired state. So whether that's an umbrella issue for what we're doing today, or a document, or a proposal for some of the how to address some of these issues, I think that's where we should proceed with some of this discussion. Because I agree, there are probably a couple different facets we could iterate on independently, but there's still that overarching goal of like, how would I implement a good workflow for embargoed security fixes today? That's the today question, and then how do we ideally implement that is sort of proposal land, I think.
So I'm also not sure how, you know, that need is prioritized for various people, you know, against other things we might do.
Right, which brings me to 110 planning. So There's a 110 milestone in the testing for repo that doesn't have a whole lot in it right now. I personally am behind in going through and actively triaging all the open issues we have in that repo, but I plan on doing that over the next couple days. I'd like to get to a point where we can discuss what our plans are for 110 next meeting. So I would ask that everybody here, if you're working on stuff or planning on working stuff, that we dump it in there. Alternatively, we've used a Google Doc to sort of go over this stuff in the past, usually put together by Eric. I'm totally fine with us collaborating there, but I'd like to be able to showcase that milestone to the community. And in kind of a related matter, Tim Sinclair's been talking about how we'd really like to make sure that the scope of this SIG encompasses not just running the tests, but also having the tests or having good tests in the first place. And so I've been trying to go through and differentiate between issues that have the area test info label and issues that have the area test label. Roughly speaking, area testing for us, most anything that's going to live in the test info repo. And area test issues are things that correspond to like the E2E framework class, or the fact that tests in the unit or integration or E2E level could stand to have certain utilities or configurations or consistency or best practices, or not expect error not to have occurred, stuff like that. So there's that. Something else that I've sent through the steering committee mailing list and this mailing list is there was a proposal to open up a new repo called Frameworks or something like that to host a reusable integration test framework. This meshes up with the steering committee proposal to create a GitHub organization for every SIG and then have each SIG. So I'm now the proud squatter of some 20-something GitHub organizations right now. And I'm trying to make Kubernetes SIG testing a good example of what the rest of those organizations would look like and what patterns we should follow from the teams that are on there to how we might support redirecting GoGet to those repos. So an open question I had for people in this group is, today we have Kates.io redirect for a number of GoGet calls. And I was wondering about having testing.kates.io redirect to Kubernetes-SIG-testing repos. And if Tim Hawken had put together some pull request to try and replace a lot of hard-coded stuff with something that was more regex-based, and I wasn't sure if we were planning on proceeding with that or doing something else. I've also seen Eric raise concerns that perhaps the overhead of administering some 20 to 30-something GitHub organizations is a little excessive, and we might want to think about having consistently named repos within a single organization. I am largely of the opinion that the time for discussion on that has passed, but I'm open to trying to have a more impassioned discussion with other members of the steering committee. But by and large, most of the people I bumped into over KubeCon and the Contributor Summit all sort of seem to naturally think that despite the suckage and lack of discoverability of so many GitHub organizations, it does kind of map pretty well to there are all these SIGs that make up the Kubernetes project, and they have ownership of different pieces of code within the project. Maybe the repos should go there. I said a bunch of things there. Any thoughts or responses to any of my questions?
I like the proposal and the execution on the proposal. I realize that there's going to be some latent inefficiencies with like any organizational structure we choose at a project this scale, right? It's all basically machinations around the fact that GitHub doesn't provide a means for us to do hierarchical organizational structures in a meaningful way that doesn't suck. So we're basically constrained by the tooling that we have to use. If someday we were able to push a lever hard enough at GitHub to make this work, I think that would be even better. I don't have strong opinions on the name or the redirector for the name. I do like consistency though, because all the other Go imports will be kates.io/something. So if we said kates.io, the problem with doing the initial kates.io/something, you're conflicting with the main repository. So having a prefix makes a lot of sense to me, or having a different name also makes a lot of sense to me. So I don't have strong opinions either way, but just make sure that we don't override with k8s.io.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it seemed to make the most sense from a discoverability perspective not to have k8s.io/foo be capable of redirecting to any one of 20 plus GitHub organizations. And so to maybe have a subdomain for every potential Kubernetes GitHub organization seemed like one way of separating it. I don't know enough about whether that's a technically dumb and infeasible idea. I'd really like to get this implemented sooner rather than later so that I can hand off ownership of this repo and get out of the way, because I'd really like to unblock the folks who proposed moving forward on this stuff.
Yeah, I would. I think sending it out to, it's already been sent out to steering. Maybe, I don't know if it's been sent out to Devel or not. There might be a broader group of folks who have opinions on it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe my more direct ask here is, Ryan, I know you've commented on Tim Hawkins' pull request around altering our GoGet redirector in k8s.io. Is what I'm proposing feasible within his pull request, or is it feasible at all? Or is there like something really silly about it? I like the proposal and the pull request in question in chat.
This is the one for this is specifically about the having separate orgs for each group, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally doable. It will take a little bit more code. We might have to switch to using a little bit of plugin instead of just a simple templating, but it's all doable. That's not going to be a blocker for that. I think more of the confusion for splitting into separate SIG orgs will be just how we suddenly have a bunch of different SIG orgs, and it gets even harder to track everything that's going on.
Yeah, so the idea there with the execution of this is I'm kind of doing it by hand as a human for the SIG testing org, and I try and set up all the best patterns here, and then we start talking about speccing this out and implementing it or handing it off to somebody to implement. My preference would, of course, be that we use some new Prow plugins to automate the management of GitHub organizations, especially like keeping consistent teams and membership across those organizations, making sure that repos follow some sort of convention when they're created in one of these things. That's all kind of down the road. I think this is more about just guinea pigging or trialing this for this one repo for the Kubernetes SIG testing org, and I just squat on all the other SIG orgs while we hash the rest of this stuff out.
Yeah, I'm not totally convinced it's the right direction. Like, I wonder if we can't do better with faking hierarchical groups with user lists in some other way, where we make our own external lists of people and we can use that. I think Azure does something like that with their cloud repositories, but
yeah, and that's something we have to do as well, right? Like,
I don't have the bandwidth to try to improve things much in any direction here. So whatever people want to work on is fine.
I think before we go pure fractal across all the SIGs, we should probably serve as a pilot test case and feedback on that community pull our experiences over time. I think for some period of time it will suck until we design automation around it.
One thought is that synchronizing state, like the list of all members and all teams across all repos, sounds to me like something that's going to once again run into like Munch GitHub-esque API call limits, especially as we get more users and more SIGs.
Yeah, that was making me wonder whether is a rate limit applied across all API tokens for a given user, or is it possible to create different tokens and have those tokens?
It's per user. You can't just make more tokens to get.
You can make more users.
Yes, you can make more users, but I don't think GitHub is a big fan of that.
We can have a bot per org.
I mean, they didn't shut my account down for creating like 30 organizations. So.
Yeah, we've created quite a number of bots, and they haven't quite yet smacked us.
Okay, yeah, like, and stuff like that is exactly why I want to get to the point of just like sort of roughly defining what the spec looks like. I'm just doing the dumb thing as a human now to see if it's usable by us humans, and then trying to do it with as mechanically as possible so we can turn that into a spec for how a bot would do it. And again, I recognize we're all super busy with other stuff, so I've been told, that in theory the CNCF has money, and the CNCF is favorable to well-scoped efforts that can be contracted out as opposed to the sort of things to hire FTEs for. And so we could take some well-written proposals that are run through this group and turn those into things that the CNCF gets somebody to implement on our code on our behalf, thus making Prow greater and more reusable for things. And the CNCF might be interested in seeing how Prow could be more reusable for more of its projects, so it's kind of a win-win, as they say. Okay, I will attempt to ping people if I need to try and push the rest of this forward. I think I had something else in the meeting notes. Oh, yeah, rolling out Tide. Tactically speaking, this is the thing I just want to keep pushing on until we finally get it done. Ben, I think you've done some fantastic stuff on Tide's UI. I've been starting to pick the highest traffic repos according to DevStats and just volunteer them for Tide. I know, I think Joe said he was going to take care of improving the status context that Tide posts to.
Yeah, we ran into some problems with that. I'm actually working on fixing that right now. Yeah, I think that there's one problem that I can't really diagnose until I fix another problem first, but I'm looking into that right now.
Okay. So maybe of interest to this group, when I suggested the Kubernetes website repo, I learned that they use multiple kinds of LGTM. So they have a docs LGTM and a tech reviewer LGTM and sometimes a translator LGTM. And I was like, well, that sounds really fun. Why don't you use this cool command called hold, where like maybe you use like approve for we are the docs people, these look good to us from a docs perspective, and then you can hold and then ask somebody from a SIG to do like tech review, and they can LGTM it. And they seemed pretty happy with that going forward. This is not the first repo I have bumped into that has weird workflows like this. I don't know if we care to try making Tide or our automation more flexible to it, or if we just apply helpful suggestions like use hold. So that's where I'm at with it. I'm curious where we feel like we're at with being able to, if there are any like technical issues preventing us from Kubernetes. Because my rolling out on a bunch of different repos is to get a bunch of different people used to it, just so that it's kind of less controversial when we turn it on for KK.
I'd say just the status would.
That's the main barrier, yeah. We want to get the statuses tried out before we deploy it to KK, just because there's going to be a lot of PRs that are suddenly affected. Yeah. And yeah, it'd be nice to test it on the like 500 or so PRs in other repos first before we unleash it on KK.
I don't know that this is necessarily a blocker, but I still think that like shiny labels or not, the Tide dashboard is a bit overwhelming, especially if you're like a new contributor and it's not clear what's going on with like the Tide pools in particular.
Documentation then too.
Yeah, we should use our JavaScript framework to create an animation of a PR, animate labels getting added to it, and then it migrates through pools.
Sounds like you just volunteered yourself, Steve.
Oh yeah.
We looked at if we could like iframe a PR and like add stuff to it, but GitHub is.
Oh yeah, iframes also the best solution.
I mean, I do think those columns could maybe use a little more explanation. And to me, one of the prerequisites for turning it on for Kubernetes is to have myself or somebody from this group do a walkthrough at the community meeting and make sure we can link to that video of just like, here's me merging a PR with Tide. Look how it's exactly the same workflow that I've always used. It's no different. But here's how I can like, show the Tide UI, I guess, to show how you're like, hey, what's going on with my PR? It's most often the question that people have, and so if that status context is pretty clear, we can just say, look at your PR, and we can, walk through the UI a little bit. So I think there is some of the touchy-feely stuff for sure before we turn it on for the broader community. But it sounds like just hammering on the context and continuing to exercise Tide and is about where we're at, I guess.
The columns in the UI as well, I think they solve kind of a different question. They're, at least in my opinion, they're more like an administrative, like what is going on with Tide. I feel like it's probably going to be pretty rare that a developer ends up on that page if we do the status correctly, because that's answering the question of what do I need to know about my PR.
Okay.
We can also add like tooltips that show up when you hover over all the columns and stuff. I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. That would be awesome. We have run out of time. That's all that I had. Anything else? Oh, Eric, you had something. I'll hand off to you.
I think something that we like a couple of us were talking about at KubeCon was, the fact that there's a bunch of people in Seattle who are interested in SIG testing, and so it might be, interesting to try and have like a get together on at least once or potentially a regular basis for, people from different, like a co-company working day or something where we try and gather in some location and, see if we can be more productive if we're all in the same coffee shop or conference room or something. So I would be interested in doing that, and, I'm interested in feedback from this group and or the Slack channel about, your thoughts.
I would be super interested, and I'm happy to chat with you offline. I will see if I can talk to employer about us doing it, but I know we have a bunch of high-powered executives showing up this week, so I don't know if I'll get their attention today. But yeah, I think that sounds like a great idea. That would be fantastic. Okay, cool. Well, great first meeting of the year, everybody. Happy Tuesday, and see you all next week.
Bye.